Welcome, everybody, to session 92 of the World of Speculative Fiction series. This time around, we are going to look at the first three books in David Edding's Belgariad. So those are Pawn of Prophecy, Queen of Sorcery, and Magician's Gambit. We'll be looking at the last two in the series in our next session. So we're going to concentrate on these three for this session. And Eddings is somebody who is new for this particular series. So we'll be looking at his biography, some of the things he's said about his own work, and the world building that has gone into it. In this case, we're kind of privileged in that there's an entire book that gathers together all of that source material. But we'll be spending the majority of our time looking at some of the world building and the key themes, both philosophical and narrative, in this excellent fantasy series. And I do want to say something before I talk about what this Worlds of Speculative Fiction is all about for anybody who's new to this. So the Belgariad and David Eddings is a recommendation that has been made to me for a number of years. I've been meaning to find a way to incorporate it into it, and it's a good friend of mine, Joanne, who has been pushing David Eddings all of this time as sort of the proverbial voice crying in the wilderness. And I've always been saying, yeah, maybe next year, maybe next year. Well, this is the year that we're going to do it. And what a great narrative, what a great writer, what a great recommendation. So I have a good friend of mine to thank for this. Now, if you're new to Worlds of Speculative Fiction, what is this? It's a series that we've been doing monthly beginning back in 2016. So this is the 10th year of the series. Originally, it was hosted in person at the Brookfield Public Library, and we would video record all of the sessions. Then when COVID hit and everything was locked down, we switched to an online format, which is what we do now. And I will be talking, about the books and the author and all that, anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes. We do a video premiere, so anybody who's watching this while it premieres can join us for a live chat, and we'll talk about it as the video is running through that stuff. If you're watching this afterwards, of course, you can feel free to comment. And then during the sessions, after we do the video premiere, we meet by Zoom to have a little bit more intimate conversation about the author, the work, the key themes, all of that. So we are going to be looking into this great set of works here. We'll begin, I think, by talking about some basic world building, then we'll go into some biography, and then we'll start jumping into philosophical themes, as well as looking at interviews and things that David Eddings has said about his own work. So we've got a lot coming up. Glad that you could join us. And again, I'm going to give a big thank you to Joanne for constantly recommending David Edding's Belgariad. We'll do volume 1, the first 3 books this session. And then next month, if you like this, we'll be picking up with volume 2, the final 2 books of this series in its original format. There are also prequels and other things as well, but we're just going to concentrate on the original 5 books. So we're going to look at the first 3 today. Buckle in. We've got a lot coming down the pike, and thanks for joining me. There is a lot of world building that went into this series from the very beginning, as David Edding tells us, particularly not just through the Belgariad, for example, in the prologue, but particularly in the later published but much earlier written, for the most part, Riven Codex, where we get the documents that he had produced originally. And so I'm going to be excerpting from bits of that, but I want to give you kind of an overview to begin with. So we're looking at a continent-wide sort of setting, and interestingly, I'll point out from the start something that we're going to come back to. So in these first 3 books, they are broken up into sections, and every single one of the sections is going to be a geographical location, but a large one. So we begin in Sendaria, where Garion has grown up under his Aunt Pole, and things start happening there. And then we move from Sendaria into Cherik, another one of the lands. We're moving north, and we'll come back to that in a bit, but I just wanted to point that out to start with. So what we've got here is a world that has been created as a setting, so to speak, but not completely explored through writing by the time that Eddings is working with it, writing this series, right? And not just geography, but also, we could say, mythology, although the myths are actually, for the most part, real. We do get some, like later on conjectures about, does this really happen? Did this really happen? But it's a story that has a long, thousands of years backstory, but we also get to see pieces of it, particularly in the prologues to these novels, and also in some reveals, we could say, along the lines. It's a world in which there are many different races of human beings, each with their own distinctive culture. They are connected with this mythology in many respects, in quite elaborate ways. So that might be the place to begin. We have this one continent, the Western continent, which is going to be explored a good bit. There's also an Eastern continent that will show up in the other books outside of this particular sequence. So maybe one of the places to begin is talking about the gods. So we're doing things kind of in a top-down and from the beginning, moving forward sort of way. That's kind of a choice rather than beginning immediately with the setting. Not a bad idea, I think. So I'm going to read a little bit from the prologue, not the entirety of it, but just some parts of it to Pawn of Prophecy. So when the world was new, the 7 gods dwelt in harmony, and the races of man were as one people. Belar, youngest of the gods, was beloved by the Aelorns. He abode with them and cherished them, and they prospered in his care. The other gods gathered peoples about them, and each god cherished his own people. But Belar's eldest brother, Alder, was god over no people. He dwelt apart from men and gods, until the day that a vagrant child sought him out. Alder accepted the child as his disciple and called him Belgarath. Belgarath learned the secret of the will and the word and became a sorcerer. Now that's going to become very important later on. We'll talk about that more down the line. They joined in brotherhood to learn at the feet of Alder, and time did not touch them. And then, now we're going to get where the conflict arises. It happened that Alder took up a stone in the shape of a globe, no larger than the heart of a child, and he turned the stone in his hand until it became a living soul. The power of the living jewel, which men called the orb of Alder, was very great, and Alder worked wonders with it. Of all the gods, Torok was the most beautiful, and his people were the Angaroks. They burned sacrifices before him, calling him Lord of Lords. Torok found the smell of sacrifice and the words of adoration sweet. The day came, however, when he heard of the orb of Alder, And from that moment, he knew no peace. Finally, in a dissembling guise, he went to Alder. "My brother, it's not fitting. You should absent yourself from our company and council. Put aside this jewel which has seduced thy mind from our fellowship." And then Alder looked into his brother's soul and rebuked him. "Why dost thou seek lordship and dominion? Torach is not Angarach enough for thee. Do not in thy pride seek to possess the orb, lest it slay thee." Great was Torach's shame at the words of Alder. He raised his hand and smote his brother. Taking the jewel, he fled. So what we've got, this primal conflict at the beginning of things. The gods themselves, because of Torach's pride and greed, are going to be divided, and this means that human beings will be divided as well. We read some more. "The other gods besought Torach to return the orb, but he would not. Then the races of man rose up and came against the hosts of Angarach and made war on them. The wars of the gods and men raged across the lands until near the high places of Coram, Torach raised the orb and forced its will to join with his to split the earth asunder. Mountains were cast down, the sea came in, but Belar and Alder joined their wills and set limits upon the sea. The races of men, however, were separated from the others, and the gods also." Now, we also are going to see a punishment or bad effect that happens to Torach. When Torach raised the living orb against the earth, it awoke and began to glow with holy flame. The face of Torach was seared by the blue fire. In pain he cast down the mountains. In anguish he cracked open the earth. In agony he let in the sea. His left hand flared and burned to ashes. The flesh on the left side of his face melted like wax, and his left eye boiled in its socket. With a great cry he cast himself into the sea to quench the burning, but his anguish was without end. So, he's damaged. And the Angarachs created an iron tower for their god, placed the orb in an iron cask, and eventually they're going to, wage war and take the orb back. Belgariad is going to be involved with that. And eventually they're going to settle putting it in Riven. So we've got some interesting backstory there happening. Let's talk about these gods now. So we mentioned there's 7 of these gods. Well, each of these gods, except for Alder, has a people. So Torach, we've already had mentioned, and the Angarachs, that's one main people. They're going to be the big baddies throughout most of this. And they live in the east. They inhabit these areas from north to south that adjoin the peoples of the west. Then we have, as we mentioned already, Alder. He doesn't have peoples, just disciples, and those disciples are sorcerers, some of whom go bad and will be involved with the story that is happening in the Belgariad, stealing the orb, taking it back. There's a lot of different cross plots, you could say. Then we have Nedra. Nedra is the god of the Tolnedrans, and they're an imperial people who we'll talk about in just a bit. We have Kaldan, who is the god of the Arens, who are, quite important in this story. We have Issa, who is the god of the Neosans, people that are kind of on the bad side, I think we'll see as we talk about in just a bit. Mara, the bereaved goddess of the Marags, most of whom have been extinguished by the time that we're involved in the story. And then we have Belar and the Aelords, right? So all of them have a place in the map, and we have, various maps around floating about. The original map that was produced by David Edding is a bit more crude than some of the later maps, and there's lots of maps in the books as well. So let's talk a little bit more about the story of the gods. This is from the book of Eilorn of the Beginnings, and we get a little bit more discussion of each of the gods being connected to the different people, and the orb of Alder and what happens to them. And we read here, Torak led his people away to the east and caused them to build a great city. They called its name Kthul Mishrak, which is the city of night. For Torak was ashamed, men saw him marred by the fire of the orb, and the light of the sun caused him pain. And so, it goes on and says, of the 6 gods who had with their people gone into the west, thus was their disposition. To the south and west, to jungles dank and rivers sluggish, went Isa, the serpent god, and the snake people. Nedra went even onto the fertile land to the north of the jungle. Kaldan took his people, the Arans, to the northwest coast. Mara sought the mountains above the Tolnedran plain. Alder, in the pain of the loss of the orb and the shame over what the jewel that he had made had wrought upon the world, retreated even into the vale which lay at the headwaters of the river bearing his name, and shut himself away from the sight of men of gods, and none came nigh to him but Belgarath, his first disciple. Right? And this is going to finish up, not finish up, but it is going to sort of bring that part of the story to an end in, the Riven Codex and the Holy Books. The Aelorans, the people of Belar, the bear god, were a hardy people and warlike, and clad themselves in the skins of bears and wolves, and shirts cunningly wrought of rings of steel, and terrible were the swords and axes of the Aelorans. And they ranged the north, yea, even unto the land of eternal ice, to find the way they might follow into Meloria, to come upon their ancient foes and destroy them and restore the orb to Alder, right? So we get this interesting part of the story going on there. So let's talk about these different peoples. Now, David Eddings is going to be quite straightforward in saying, do you see parallels between some of these different peoples? Well, that's because I based them on historical cultures of humanity. So the Tolnedran Empire it's not exactly the same thing as the Roman Empire, but it's, just drawn from that. The Chereks, are they the Vikings? Well, not exactly, but pretty close. And then he says, there were some other groups of people that I just kind of made up, but each of them is important in this fantasy world. So the Aelorns, right? The people of Belar, they wind up inhabiting the northwestern part of the western continent. And among them, I've already mentioned the Rivans. Well, there is an island, the Isle of the Winds, where we see Riva, and that is where the Rivans are from. And at certain points in the story, we see Garion being said, you kind of look like you've got some Riven blood in you, right? And there's some prophecies about the Rivens that are quite important. We do have the Chereks further north, very much like the Vikings, love to drink ale, love to fight, all those sorts of things that are going on, very connected with bears. We have the Drasnians to their west. We have the Algars. The Algars are a horse people, right? And we're going to get important characters from each of these groups in the course of the story. So they're all basically in the northwest or the northernmost parts of the map, and there's going to be visits to their realms in the course of the story. Then we have the Arans, and the Arans are living in the western part, divided into duchies and various people. They tend to be, drawing upon sort of Arthurian / English stuff later on. And there are the Mimbrates, the Asturians. The Mimbrates actually talk with these and thous and in very flowery language. And we get to see a knight who comes along. Then we have the Tolnedrans, and they occupy a pretty vast area. They are a very pragmatic people. They think that sorcery is mostly superstition. They don't really buy into that. They're skeptical of that. We get to see it, the crown princess saying those sorts of things, even though she is very clearly acquainted with magic of a certain sort because she's part dryad, right? So dryads exist down in the south, and she's, that's part of her lineage. And the Tolnedrian Empire is very much about commerce, about things that you can hold in your hand or see in the eyes of others, about prestige, about, social etiquette, all of those sorts of things. And the empire is kind of at the center of the map. Then we have to the south, the Niesans. And these are people who, worship the snake god. They're a matriarchal society. As we're going to find out, there's actually an evil sorceress, but not evil in the same way that the followers of Torok and his people, the Angaraks, are. It's a different sort of thing. They use a lot of poisons and drugs. They're a slave-holding society, and we're going to spend a bit of time in there. Then we have the Marags. The Marags are gone, and they were essentially decimated by the Tolnedrans in a war with them. And their god spends a lot of time mourning over them. We do also have this group called the Ulgos, and here we have to change the story about the gods a little bit, because we didn't mention Ul. Ul is another god, and Ul is going to be appealed to by some of the people who don't have gods. And there's actually a long story in the Riven Codex about how this comes about, which you can read if you want to. I'll just give you the thumbnail of it. We have a particularly persistent person who is going to, for years, try to get Ul to become the god for the peoples who don't have a god, and for the monster creatures like dragons and, unicorns that don't have a god either. So very interesting there. Eventually Ul relents, and the Ulgos are a people who originally live above ground, but then things go bad and the creatures are going after them and other people are going after them. They retreat into caves, and they can be found in Ulgoland. Right? And it takes a lot to actually reach them, but we're going to see they will become part of the story as well. And then we get the big baddies, you could say, the Angaraks. They live in the east. The power base is really in the southeast, you could say. And they're divided into a number of different sub-peoples, which were originally tied to social classes. And they have some pretty strong antagonism with each other. The reasons why they're not killing each other typically is, they actually do kill each other sometimes, is because their god told them, knock it off, you can't do that sort of thing anymore. And so we have the Murgos, who are sort of like an aristocratic warrior ruling class. We have the Thals, who are, farmers, workers, not very bright, often get sacrificed, unfortunately. And then the Nadraks, who are more of a mercantile class. And then we have the priests, the Graulims, many of whom can do something like sorcery, although it's not exactly the same thing. They possess powers. and they are, you could say, close to being the primary antagonists of the story. We also do have, I mentioned dryads. We're going to see other non-human races in it as well, like trolls, Algroths, the Eldraken, who are particularly terrifying and require quite a few of the members of the company, let's say, to just even fight one of them. And all of this is encompassed within the larger story. In the Riven Codex, again, providing some sort of background that Eddings had worked out in advance, he's got a long section called the Histories. And each of them tells us about a different group, different region. And so, for example, let me just pick the one of Sendaria where the story begins. So he tells us Sendaria, or the Lake Country, is one of the smallest of the 12 kingdoms. It lies on the northwest coast and encompasses those lands to the west of the Elgarian grasslands, north of the Greater Kamar River. It is bordered by Erendia and Ulgoland to the south, Algaria to the east, the Gulf of Cherik to the north, and the Sea of the Winds to the west. Although there are mountains, they are largely uninhabited, and the bulk of the population lives in the fertile plain extending from their western slopes to the Sea of the Winds. Because of the abundant rainfall and rich soil, Sendaria is the breadbasket of the western kingdoms, and her agricultural exports provide one of the pillars of commerce. It's also one of the more thickly populated kingdoms. It is above all a tidy nation with neat farms and well-scrubbed cities, right? And it goes on to tell us about the people. Perhaps the best way to describe a Sendar is to repeat the old joke wherein one man asks another, "What is a Sendar?" And the other replies by asking, "Indeed, what is he not?" In truth, Sendaria, the crossroads of the north, is home to virtually every racial stock to be found in the west. Because of the enormous fertility of the land, settlers from every kingdom have found their way there. It is even possible in certain remote villages to find certain strikingly pure Angarak strains. The land is settled by Aelorns from the northern kingdoms, Orens and Tolderans from the south, and even an occasional Nissian, right? So, quite interesting there. We get the history of Sendaria. We get things about the coinage, costume, social organization, rank, modes of address, manners, holidays, religious observance, and even a speculation about the population, perhaps 3 to 4 million. And we get this for all of these different areas that are being discussed. Erendia, Ulgoland, the Snake People, the Angarak Kingdom. So there's a lot involved here that we're getting in sort of a didactic way in the Riven Codex, which is lying in the background to the books themselves in this first 3 set of novels in this particular volume. And as I mentioned, the 3 books, the Pawn of Prophecy, Queen of Sorcery, Magician's Gambit, they are divided into sections, and the sections are named after the places that they have moved into. So we begin in Sendaria, which is where Garion has been growing up. We move then up north to Cherik, and we spend a good bit of time there. We start heading south in the second book to Erendia, spend a good bit of time there as well. And on the way, the group is picking up companions who are going to play a role. Then we are in the Empire, Tolnedra, right? In the center of things, we could say. And they end up going to the south and winding up in the woods of the Dryads. And then we get to Nyissa, where the, serpent people live, and the Snake Queen and Garion are going to cross paths. Actually, she's going to try to take him over. And then in the third book, what do we have? Maragor. We move into yet another region. And now we're starting to get closer to the kingdom of the Angarax, the big baddies, right? And they're still trying to track down this stolen orb, because that's, sort of the key to this whole thing. So they spend time in Maragor, then they wind up in the Vale of Alder, where it is that the sorcerers have been trained and came from. Garion is going to get a bit of training there. And we're going to move into Ulgo land, going underground. And we will finish up by moving now into the land of the baddies in Cathol Murgos, right? So we're moving east into the heart of danger, and that is where the third book is going to end. I'm not going to tell you anything more about the two books that follow, because I do want to keep this relatively short, but we're exploring this vast, rich landscape, geography, mythology, history. All of this is part of the world building involved in these stories. As we're looking at David Edding's biography and his body of work, much of which is actually co-written with his wife, Leigh, what we're going to discover there are some themes, both we could call them literary and philosophical, particularly ethical, that are going to inevitably arise. And some of these are really major issues. And I would say that a good portion of this can be attributed to something that we're going to talk about quite a bit in just a few moments, the fact that David Eddings and Leigh Eddings went to prison for child abuse after being, arrested and found guilty of that, something that doesn't show up in his official biography and some of the stories that he tells. So you can say, we're posed with a big question that a lot of fans have brought up. Can we separate the art from the artist, or is the art in some way marred by the missteps, the failings, the wrongs of the artists? We also have, a question of truthfulness that arises as well. Should we consider him a somewhat unreliable narrator, at least about certain parts of his life, why things turned out the way that they did? Perhaps so. He's very candid about other things, as we're going to see. So I'm going to leave those as open questions for the moment, but I'm sure they're going to provoke some discussion. So let's launch now with that preface into looking at the life of this author. So he's born in 1931 in Spokane, Washington, to George and Theone Eddings. And he grows up, according to himself, near Puget Sound in a city called, I'm hopefully pronouncing this right, Snohomish. And he, does this sort of typical thing, goes to, elementary school, middle school, high school, graduates from high school in 1949. So, the war has been going on during his younger years. If he started high school in 45, he starts after World War II. And he works for about a year and then decides to go to junior college. And he's particularly interested in acting, so he's studying drama and speech, but also literature. And during this time, he begins working in grocery stores, something that he's going to do for quite a while. And, it's kind of like washing dishes or other, as we call them, entry-level jobs. They don't pay very well, although wages were indeed a good bit higher by comparison to today for these minimum wage jobs, as we call them in the present. And you could effectively live on them, not very well, but you could keep, things together. So the nice thing about jobs like that is they're incredibly portable. As he points out in interviews later on, you can go anywhere and you can stock grocery stores or work as a cashier or anything along those lines. So he ends up going to Reed College, and he gets a BA, and he actually writes his first novel as a senior thesis, and that is How Lonely Are the Dead? He graduates in 1954. So interestingly, the Korean War is winding down at that time. And he had actually had a number of deferrals. Every year, he said the draft board would call him in for an interview, and they would say, are you still going to college? Do you want a deferment? And he'd say, yeah, I want to finish my college. So graduating in 1954, he now gets drafted into the U.S. Army. They don't send him to Korea. Instead, they send him to Germany, and he travels around a good bit, studies German. It's actually not a bad gig for him for 2 years. He gets out in 1956, and he gets out with the GI Bill, which he then uses to go to graduate school at the University of Washington. And usually it takes you about 2, maybe 3 years to get your master's degree. He actually, the GI Bill gives you 4 years of benefits. Well, he uses all 4 years of those benefits and graduates in 1961, writing another novel as his master's thesis called Man Running. And then he gets a job as a purchaser for Boeing. There he meets Judith Schall, who is going to, they're going to date, and then they get married. Judith Leigh Schall, she'll start going by Leigh Eddings later on. And they get married in 1962. They're in New Orleans. He's got some interesting things to say. And you're going to notice me referring to this book, the Riven Codex, where he provides some of his own biography in there, as well as a lot of other stuff, as we've talked about already. So, he says, I'll just mention this is kind of interesting. I married a young lady whose history was even more interesting than mine. I was a little miffed when I discovered her security clearance was higher than mine. I thought top secret was the top of the line, but I was wrong. She'd also been to places I hadn't ever even heard of since she'd been in the Air Force while I'd been a ground pounder. I discovered she was a world-class cook, a highly skilled fisherwoman, and after an argument about whether or not that was really a deer lying behind that log 100 yards away late one snowy afternoon, she demonstrated she was a dead shot with a deer rifle by shooting old Bambi right between the eyes. So, kind of an interesting story there that he's telling. And what's going to end up happening is they're going to move around a bit. They're going to go to South Dakota, and he is going to take a position as an assistant professor at Black Hills State College. And then there's going to be a sequence of moves to Denver, back to Spokane, eventually to Carson City, Nevada. And the story, as he tells it, is I taught college for several years. Then one year, the administrators all got a pay raise and the teaching faculty didn't. I told them what they could do with their job, and my wife and I moved to Denver, where I, in parentheses, we wrote High Hunt in our spare time while I worked in a grocery store, and my wife worked as a hotel maid. Now, that's actually leaving out some of the details about what happened in his life and what happened with both of them, and not just what happened to them, but what they did and the repercussions of it. So much later, it came to light through newspaper articles and people finding, connections on the internet, that in 1970, both of them were arrested and then tried and convicted of 11 counts of child abuse. So they had adopted a 2-month-old boy, Scott, in 1966. At the time that he was discovered downstairs in the basement in some really strange circumstances, which you can look up online. He was 4 years old, and it looks like the abuse had gone on for quite a while. There was some weird stuff that other people recalled later about how they behaved in public. They also adopted a daughter who was younger. She was only 18 months at the time that they were arrested. And it's very clear that there was not only physical but also mental abuse, that they had some really strange ideas about how to raise a child, and they effectively traumatized and terrorized the 4-year-old boy, maybe also the daughter. It gets a little hazy at this point. It's difficult to find the information because this is a long time ago, and there's a tendency to protect children who are subject to abuse. Long story short, they are both tried. They are both convicted. They both go to prison for relatively short sentences, 1 year for each of them, in separate prisons. And while David Eddings is in the prison, he actually publishes his novel High Hunt in 1971. And this is the real reason why they left the college. You couldn't work anymore if you're in prison. And so it doesn't actually look like this story about, I was taking a stand about equity and pay is real. It looks like a fabulation on his part. And, his wife certainly went along with it as well. And then they move eventually back to Spokane. And while they're both there, he is working again in grocery stores. She is working as a hotel maid. Why are they doing that? Well, it's not that easy to get remunerative work as an ex-con, right? So maybe that's part of the story there. In the meantime, he is working on what he considers to be serious novels. So he says, I was convinced I was a serious novelist. I labored long and hard over several unpublished and unpublishable novels that moped around the edges of mawkish contemporary tragedy. In the mid-1970s, I was grinding out Hunsaker's Ascent, a story about mountain climbing, which was such a piece of tripe so bad that it even bored me. You can't see it because I burned it. And two important things occur at this time in this period in the 1970s. One is he starts working on a map where he's doodling around, and he says, I was so bored, I started producing this map of a place that that never was and is probably a geological impossibility. And then some years later, he's in a bookstore going in the general direction of the serious fiction. I passed the science fiction rack and spotted one of the volumes of Lord of the Rings. Now, Eddings was very familiar with Tolkien. He had been, when he was a professor, he was teaching literature, and he taught Tolkien in some of his classes, along with lots of other modernist stuff, as researchers have found by going through his papers later on. And so he says, I muttered to myself, is this old turkey still floating around? I picked it up, and I noticed it was in its 78th printing. That got my immediate attention, and I went home and dug out the aforementioned doodle. It seemed to have some possibilities. Now, what possibilities are we talking about? Commercial possibilities. And we're going to see that Eddings goes about writing these fantasy books in a very, very deliberate way, which we'll get to a little bit later. So he says, methodical as always, I ticked off the above listed necessities for a good medieval romance, which we'll come back to in a bit. And I realized I was going to have to populate this world and create the assorted ologies before I could even begin to put together an outline. The Riven Codex, the texts that are contained in this, was the result. And he said, I reasoned each culture had to have a different class structure, a different mythology, a different theology, different costumes, different forms of address, different national character, and even different coinage and slightly different weights and measures. I might never come right out and use them in the books, but they had to be there. So he began working on preliminary materials, doing the kind of stuff that, interestingly, Tolkien himself had done in his own preparatory work, let's call it. So Eddings is going to then, begin working on this, and he pitches the project to Lester Del Rey. He actually says, I wrote to a lot of different places. Lester Del Rey gets back in touch with him. And he says that when I'd first submitted my proposal for the Belgariad, I'd expected the usual leisurely reaction time. Lester responded with what I felt to be unseemly haste. He wanted to see this thing now, but I wasn't ready to let him see it. I was in revision of what I thought would be book one. We'll talk about that in a moment. And since I was still doing honest work in those days, grocery store work, my time was curtailed. I wanted to keep him interested, so I sent my preliminary studies instead. All these sort of notes and world building, essentially. And then Lester said, well, we can't publish this stuff at all, which later on, of course, they did, right? And so there's this long process of development that's taking place. Now, he is going to say these studies are almost 20 years old. That's not 20 years from doing the preliminary work to the Belgariad, rather 20 years till this volume is actually published. And what he's going to do is publish a 5-book series that becomes the Belgariad in a very short amount of time, 1982 to 1984. It was originally intended as a trilogy, and we get a very interesting set of reflections here, which show us that a lot of this depends on the, let's call it, commercial setting and environment. So here's all these studies he's talking about. He says, my original proposal envisioned a trilogy, 3 books tentatively titled Garion, Kenedra, and Kaltorak. That notion tumbled down around my ears when Lester explained the realities of the American publishing business to me. B. Dalton and Walden Books, which some of us are old enough to remember as really big, important chains, but they're basically gone at this point in time, had limits on genre fiction. Those 2 chains ruled the world. At that time, they wanted genre fiction to be paperbacks priced under $3 and thus no more than 300 pages. So Lester said, we're going to break it up into 5 books instead of 3. My original game plan went out the window. I choked and went on. The chess piece titles were also Lester's idea. I didn't like that very much. I wanted to call book 5 In the Tomb of the One-Eyed God. I thought it had a cool ring to it. However, Lester explained that a title that long wouldn't leave any room for a cover illustration. So again, what's going to sell, and that's going to be quite important. So in any case, he's going to publish the first part of the series that will later expand into effectively 12, or if you include this one, 13 books. So we have the Belgariad between 1982 to 1984. Lay, by the way, is deeply involved in the writing process David Eddings is super clear about that, and he also says that it was Lester Del Rey that said, well, if you co-write it and you give credit, it's probably not going to sell as well. So that's why they were published solely under his name. And then we get the Mallorean series running from 1987 to 1991, another 5-book series. Then we get 2 other books, Belgariad the Sorcerer, 1991, Polgora the Sorceress, 1997, and then finally the Riven Codex in 1998. He also publishes a number of other series. The Elenum series, 3 books from 1989 to 1991. The Tamuli series, another 3 books, 1992 to 1994. So you notice there he can do the trilogy thing. The Dreamer series has 4 books and runs from 2003 to 2006. And then there's a standalone, the Redemption of Attalus. And what allows him to be able to devote himself to writing in this way is, in fact, that the Belgariad were bestsellers. Every single one of the books is a major success. That gives them plenty of money to work with. It's quite interesting to see just how wealthy they did become. And, the story effectively comes to an end in the 2000s with the death of Leigh and then the death a little bit later of David. So Leigh starts having strokes in perhaps 1999 or 2000, and she requires home care. David Eddings provides that. His mother-in-law also moves in, and they're helping out with that. In 2007, Leigh is going to die, but about a month before she dies, David accidentally starts a fire while working on his sports car. And he comes right out and says, wow, it was really, really stupid. I was trying to get, this stuff out of the tank. I wasn't sure whether it was water or gasoline. So what did I do? I threw a piece of lit paper down on it, and it starts a big fire, burns his garage, burns some other stuff, but fortunately it's put out before it gets too bad. But it seems like this is a sign of a dementia that had been developing for a while, probably before the death of his wife. He will die in 2009. People are pretty clear, including his younger brother, that he had been suffering from dementia, but had kind of kept it under wraps from people for quite a while. And interestingly, we find out that there were 2 really big gifts from their estate. So he leaves $10 million to the National Jewish Hospital in Denver, where they lived for a short time. And there's conjecture that, because Leigh had suffered from asthma, and this was an important hospital for respiratory illnesses, that maybe that's why he did that. And, this is quite a lot of money. It'll be a lot even in the present. It was even more back in 2009, 2010. And the other big bequest is $18 million to Reed College, where he went to as an undergraduate. And part of it was, to go into the general endowment, always important for academic institutions. Part of it was to create an endowed chair. And then a lot of it was to create scholarships for students for, things like literature and drama, particularly for low-income students who otherwise might not be able to afford to go to Reed College, which is a private school. So, if we think about the nature of his life, I think we should come back to the child abuse, not just allegations, but, actual conviction. So that's happening relatively early on, and I'm not making any justification for this. It sounds like it was pretty terrible. The only redeeming feature of it is it doesn't look like it involved any sexual abuse. And, they did keep it under wraps. It was something that very few people apparently knew about until much later on. Interestingly, when the stories first broke and started getting into the Wikipedia articles, the editors resisted allowing it to be there. If you go on Wikipedia now and look it up, you will find it there. But at first, there was considerable resistance. How could somebody who writes such wonderful stories have been such a bad person? Well, the stories are actually coming later. We don't really know because we don't hear from Eddings, either of them, because they keep it effectively a secret, whether they learned a lesson, whether they felt deep regret, remorse, shame, repentance. It does, possibly tarnish not just their legacy, but also the reading of the novels for a lot of people. They'll sometimes be like, how could you, have all these bad characters who were supposed to root for the good guys to fight against, and you yourself seem to have been one of the baddies preying upon a child in this way, perhaps two children. Again, we don't really know. So this is a big ethical question. Certainly, there's probably a good bit of pressure to not reveal it. We can also say that it was also probably a good bit harder to arrest somebody and to convict them back then in 1970 than it is in the present. So, that probably tells you about the extent of the abuse as well. But you can also look it up in newspaper articles that exist out there and see what they actually discovered. Was this big bequest for a hospital, for a college, an attempt to sort of set the scales right? We don't really know. So that remains kind of an open question. I do want to come back to one thing that I think is quite interesting that's revealed in this book. By the way, here's that map that was referenced, right? First place of a map that never was, the 12 kingdoms of the West. So you might view this as a bit cynical. Eddings is going about to, in a very systematic way, write genre fiction that will be good, but also will sell. And he is going to give you here a number of, here we go. Operating by trial and error mostly, we've evolved a tacitly agreed upon list of the elements that make for a good fantasy. The first decision the aspiring fantasist must make is theological. King Arthur, Charlemagne were Christians. Siegfried and Sigurd, the Volsung, were pagans. My personal view is that pagans write better stories. When a writer's having fun, it shows, and pagans have more fun than Christians, right? So he says, okay, for item number one, I chose paganism. And he says, note that Papa Tolkien, a devout Anglo-Catholic, took the same route. Item number two on our interim list is the quest. If you don't have a quest, you don't have a story. The quest gives you some excuse to dash around and meet new people. Otherwise, you stay home and grow turnips or something. Item number three is the magic thingamajig, the Holy Grail, the Ring of Power, the magic sword, the sacred book, or, surprise, the jewel. Everyone knows where I came down on that one. The magic thingamajig is usually, though not always, the object of the quest. Item four is our hero, Sir Galahad, Sir Gawain, Sir Lancelot, or Sir Percival. Galahad is saintly, Gawain is loyal, Lancelot is the heavyweight champion of the world, and Percival's dumb, at least right at first. I went with Percival because he's more fun. Now, who's that? That's Garion, right? Ben Garion. And he says he's innocent more than stupid in the same way Percival was. Item number 5 is the resident wizard. Merlin usually, or Gandalf, mighty, powerful, and mysterious. I scratched that one right away and went with Belgariad instead, and I think it was the right choice. So now we're starting to get pretty formulaic, aren't we? Item 6 is our heroine. Usually a wispy blonde girl who spends most of her time mooning around in a tower. I chose not to go down that route. Kenedra is a spoiled brat, there's no question about that, but she's a little tiger when the chips are down. She turned out even better than I expected. Item 7 is a villain with diabolical connections. I invented Torak and he served our purpose rather well. I even managed to give him a fairly believable motivation. Milton helped on that one. Torak isn't exactly Lucifer, but he comes close. As usual, he has a number of evil underlings to do his dirty work for him. Then he says, item 8 is the obligatory group of companions, that supporting cast of assorted muscular types from various cultures who handle most of the killing and mayhem until the hero grows up to the point where he can do his own violence on the bad guys. Item 9 is a group of ladies who are attached to the bully boys in item 8. Each of these ladies also needs to be well-defined with idiosyncrasies and passions of her own. Finally, we come to item 10. Those are the kings, queens, emperors, courtiers, bureaucrats, and others who are the governments of the kingdom of the world. End of list. If you've got those 10 items, you're on your way towards a contemporary fantasy. So, is this just a formula? Well, yes, it's a very detailed skeleton, we could say. Obviously, it takes more than just doing that to come up with a good set of fantasy stories. But he was in a way painting by numbers. And why would he do that? Well, he had studied literature among a number of other interrelated things. So he's like, hey, Milton's Satan is a good template for Torak, right? And we do also read one other interesting thing along those lines. So he says, among the literary theories I'd encountered in graduate school was Jung's notion of archetypal myth. And then he says something quite funny. The application of this theory usually involves a scholar laboring mightily to find correspondences between current and not so current fiction and drama to link them to Greek mythology. And then he says, it occurred to me that archetypal myth might not be very useful in the evaluation of a story, but might it not work in its creation? I tried it, and it works. I planted more mythic fishhooks in the first couple books than you'll find in any sporting goods store, right? And, so he's saying, hey, I actually had kind of a method that I was using for developing these stories. Now, he's very open and honest about that, which I think is a good thing. It would seem that for somebody who's actually done a lot of the groundwork, not just reading and studying and taking notes, but even teaching literature and being able to compare and contrast different kinds of literature against each other, maybe that affords a greater expertise in using all of these tropes. But he is saying, hey, I'm using tropes. And why? Because they actually work effectively. And so I think that's an interesting place to end this biography. And I'm going to suggest something completely speculative. Maybe part of what's going on is not just, the need to conceal bad deeds and move on and live your life and become a great, novelist along with your wife who's helping you out and make a lot of money and live the kind of life that you want to. Maybe it's a deliberate choice in how to tell the story of the storyteller, which, again, does not absolve the Eddings of anything, but maybe that informs this vexed question that always arises of, good art, perhaps even great art, coming from deeply flawed, perhaps even on some level, wicked or evil artists, and how we should make sense of that. So that's probably enough about biography, planting some interesting seeds for conversation or reflection for you, hopefully. Now let's move on and talk about some other matters coming up in these novels. There are a number of different themes, both literary and philosophical, that run throughout these first three books of the Belgariad, and I think maybe it's best to begin with one of the great overarching, behind the scenes for the most part, make sense of everything else kind of themes that is woven into the work, and that has to do with not just a prophecy, but we could call it multiple and converging, but also opposed prophecies. It's kind of an interesting point. In order to make sense of this, I have to tell you one thing at the start, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later on or have references to, which is that Garion, who is the most central character, we could definitely say the chosen one according to the long established trope, has a, let's call him passenger, who turns out to be an incredibly important, powerful, and old entity. And this entity talks to him, observes through his eyes, at times uses his body and, the apparatus of his mind. And it explains some important aspects to him. So we're going to begin, and this is relatively late in this first three books, in this section from the portion of it called Madrigal. So I'll just read this straight out. "I see that you're finally awake," the other mind said to him. "No," Garion corrected. "Actually, a part of me is asleep, I think. That was the part that kept getting in the way. We can talk now. We have some things to discuss." So what we're going to get here is a bit of an info dump through some dialogue that's taking place. "Who are you?" Garion asked, absently following Aunt Pole's instructions to get back on his horse. "I don't actually have a name." "You're separate from me, though, aren't you? I mean, you're not just another part of me, are you?" "No," the voice replied. "We're quite separate." "What do you want?" Garion asked. "I need to make things come out the way they're supposed to. I've been doing that for a very long time now." So we're getting a revelation here about somebody working behind the scenes. Garion considered that. "I'm going to go mad, aren't I? I'm not asleep like the others are, and the ghosts will drive me mad, won't they?" "I doubt it," the voice answered. "You'll see some things you'd probably rather not see, but I don't think it'll destroy your mind. You might even learn some things about yourself that will be useful later on." "You're very old, aren't you?" Garion asked as the thought occurred to him. "That term doesn't have any meaning in my case." "Older than my grandfather?" Garion persisted. "I knew him when he was a child. It might make you feel better to know that he was even more stubborn than you are. It took me a very long time to get him started in the direction he was supposed to go." "Did you do it from inside his mind?" "Naturally." And then Garion says, "Then he knows you, doesn't he? If you were in his mind, I mean." "He didn't know I was there." "I've always known you were there." "You're different. That's what we need to talk about." So a lot of important information revealed already. A little bit further on, Garion says, "In what way am I different? Something needs to be done, and you're the one who's going to do it. All the others have just been in preparation for you." What is it exactly I have to do? You'll know when the time comes. If you find out too soon, it might frighten you. The voice took on a somewhat wry note. You're difficult enough to manage without additional complications. Why are we talking about it then? You need to know why you have to do it. That might help you when the time comes. All right, Garian agreed. Excuse me. A very long time ago, excuse me, here's the info dump. A very long time ago, something happened that wasn't supposed to happen, the voice in his mind began. The universe came into existence for a reason, and it was moving towards that purpose smoothly. Everything was happening the way it was supposed to happen, but then something went wrong. It wasn't really a big thing, but it just happened to be in the right place at the right time, or perhaps in the wrong place at the wrong time might be a better way to put it. Anyway, it changed the direction of events. Can you understand that? I think so, Garian replied. It's like when you throw a rock at something, but it bounces off something else instead and goes to where you don't want it to go, like the time Darun threw that rock at the crow and it hit a tree limb and bounced off and broke Faldor's window instead. That's exactly it, the voice congratulated him. Up to that point, there had been only one possibility, the original one. Now there were suddenly two. Let's take it one step further. If Darun or you had thrown another rock very quickly and hit the first rock before it got to Faldor's window, it's possible that the first rock might have been knocked back to hit the crow instead of the window. Maybe, Garian conceded doubtfully. Darun wasn't really that good at throwing rocks. I'm much better at it than Darun, the voice told him. That's the whole reason I came into existence in the first place. In a very special way, you're the rock I've thrown. If you hit the other rock just right, you'll turn it and make it go where it was originally intended to go. And if I don't, Faldor's window gets broken. So he goes on and says, we have to get things back on the right course. This certain thing you have to do is the key to the whole business. For a long time, what was supposed to happen and what was actually happening went off in different directions. Now they're starting to converge again. The point where they meet is the point where you'll have to act. If you succeed, things will be all right again. If you don't, everything will keep going wrong. And the purpose for which this universe came into existence will fail. How long ago was it when this started? Before the world was made, even before the gods. So I'm going to pause on that for a moment. This is big, isn't it? So Garian is the chosen one in a certain way, in that he's supposed to set things right. There's a cosmic force that was guiding his great million times grandfather, and now is guiding him, but in a different way to try to set things right. And this has to call it grand is a bit of an understatement, metaphysical, cosmological motif running throughout all of it, right? So then we get an interesting question. Garian asked, will I succeed? And I don't know, the voice replied. I know what's supposed to happen, not what will. And there's something else you need to know too. When this mistake occurred, it set off two separate lines of possibility. And a line of possibility has a kind of purpose. To have a purpose, there has to be awareness of that purpose. To put it rather simply, that's what I am, the awareness of the original purpose of the universe. So that's a big reveal, but then it gets even more interesting. Only now there's another one too, isn't there? Garian suggested another awareness. One connected with the other set of possibilities. You're even brighter than I thought. And wouldn't it want things to keep going wrong? I'm afraid so. Now we come to the important part. The spot in time where all this is going to be decided one way or another is getting very close, and you've got to be ready. Why me? Garion asked. Can't somebody else do it? No. That's not the way it works. The universe has been waiting for you for more millions of years than you could even imagine. You've been hurtling towards this event since before the beginning of time. It's yours alone. You're the only one who can do what needs to be done, and it's the most important thing that'll ever happen, not just in this world, but all the worlds in the universe. There are whole races of men on worlds so far away that the light from their suns will never reach this world. They'll cease to exist if you fail. They'll never know you or thank you, but their entire existence depends on you. The other line of possibility leads to absolute chaos and the ultimate destruction of the universe, but you and I lead to something else. What? If you're successful, you'll live to see it happen. So, again, this is the chosen one on steroids. The entire universe depends on Garion getting this right and succeeding. So it's not just one world, it's the totality of worlds. We're dealing with two sentient cosmic forces, and Garion is at we could call it fulcrum or crux point. So the last part of this, Garion says, what do I have to do now? And the voice says, you have enormous power. It's been given to you so you can do what you have to do, but you've got to learn how to use it. Belgariad and Polgara are trying to help you learn, so stop fighting with them about it. You've got to be ready when the time comes, and the time is much closer than you might think. Right? So that's, returning us, you might say, to not the more mundane, but certainly at least the less cosmic, right? Then we get a little bit more at the end of this section, right? And Garion is talking with Pol and Wolf, and they're talking about what's going on, what he learned, right? So Garion says, Wolf says, what did the other one in your head say to you when you talked together? Garion says, he told me that something had happened a long time ago that wasn't supposed to happen and that I was supposed to fix it. Wolf laughed shortly. That's a succinct way of putting it. Did he say anything about how it's going to turn out? He doesn't know. Wolf sighed. I'd hoped maybe we'd picked up an advantage somewhere, but I guess not. Now notice what he says here. It looks like both prophecies are still equally valid. And so he's going to elaborate. There are two prophecies, both leading towards the same event. The Growlums and the rest of the Angaraks are following one. We're following the other. The event turns out differently at the end of each prophecy. Nothing in either prophecy excludes anything that will happen in the other until they meet in that event. The course of everything that follows will be decided by how that event turns out. One prophecy will succeed, the other will fail. Everything that has happened and will happen comes together at that point and becomes one. The mistake will be erased and the universe will go in one direction or the other, as if that were the direction it had been going from its very beginning. The only real difference is that something that's very important will never happen if we fail. And Wolf goes on, Belden calls it the theory of convergent destinies, two equally possible possibilities. Belden can be very pompous sometimes. So this is a great exposition of what is actually been happening in the books and what will continue to be happening as well. And we're going to get an interesting reference. So there have been a couple points where a number of different personages have been brought up as part of the prophecy. At the end of the third book, where the big confrontation is taking place, in the heart of the enemy's stronghold, the high priest is going to talk about all of these people that are supposed to be along. And all of them have, we could say, functional titles rather than names. So the high priest says, I see the nimble thief and the man with 2 lives and the blind man, but I don't see the others. Where's the dreadful bear and the night protector, the horse lord and the bowman and the ladies? Where are the queen of the world and the mother of the race that died, right? And Belgariad says, all well, Tukchik, all well. And the high priest says, how extraordinary. I was almost certain you'd have lost 1 or 2 by now. I admire your dedication, old man, to keep intact for all these centuries a prophecy that would have collapsed if one single ancestor had died at the wrong time. His eyes grew distant momentarily. Ah, I see you left them below to stand guard. You didn't have to do that. I left orders we weren't to be disturbed. And as it's going to turn out, we're going to find that these other people are not all there. The queen of the world has been left behind for her own safety. And we should probably talk a little bit about what happens there. So, you know, the high priest is framing it as if human sorcerers had set all this up. We know from the information that's been given by the voice inside Garian's head that no, there's something else deeper happening behind the scene. Now, going back to in Ulgo, Kenedra is going to, along with the others, encounter a god, the god of the Ulgos, the god Ul. Right? So we have a theophany happening here, and we learn some very interesting things. So Ul is looking at Relg, this priest who has gotten a little bit too big for his britches, we could say. Ul is looking into Relg's awestruck face. Thy mind hath twisted what I told thee, my son. Thou hast turned my words to make them conform to thy desire rather than to my will. I told thee that the child who will be Gorum will come to Ulgo through thee, and that thou must prepare thyself to nurture him, see to his rearing. Did I tell thee to exalt thyself by reason of this? Relg began to shake violently. Did I tell thee to preach sedition or to stir Ulgo against the Gorum who have chosen to guide them? And then Relg collapses. Forgive me, oh my God. He's groveling. And Ul says, rise, Relg. I am not pleased with thee, and thine obeisance offends me, for thine heart is filled with pride. I will bend thee to my will, Relg, or I will break thee. I will purge thee of this overweening esteem thou hast for thyself. Only then wilt thou be worthy of the task to which I have sent thee. And Relg is going to be added to the company that is on the mission to recover the orb, right? So then Ul is going to talk to the Gorum, the priest of his people. Abide yet a while, my son, though the years press heavily upon thee, it shall not be long until thy burden shall be lifted. Know that I am pleased with thee. So one religious leader gets his comeuppance, the older religious leader is being affirmed. And then we have some interesting things happening. So, Belgarath, Ul greeted the sorcerer. I have watched thee at thy task, and I share thy master's pride in thee, one of the gods, right? The prophecy moves through thee and Polgara, thy daughter, towards the moment we've all awaited. So another important reference to one line of prophecy. Truly, all agreed when Belgarath says, it's been a long time. It hath surprised us all on occasion. Hath Alder's gift to the world come into his birthright as yet? Not entirely, most holy, Polgara answered gravely. He's touched the edges of it, however, and what he's shown us so far gives us hope for his success. Hail then, Belgarian, all said to the startled young man. Take my blessing with thee, and know that I will join with Alder to be with thee when thy great task begins. And then all the god is going to, so we get, it seemed to Kenedra, the god was communicating wordlessly to some other presence, something that was part of Garian and not part of him. He nodded gravely then and turned his gaze directly upon the princess herself. She seems but a child, he observed to Polgara. She's of suitable age, most holy, Polgara replied. She's a dryad, and they're all quite small. All smiled gently at the princess, and she found herself suddenly glowing in the warmth of that smile. She is like a flower, is she not? She still has a few thorns, most holy, Belgarath replied wryly, and a bit of bramble in her nature. We will value her all the more for that, Belgarath. The time will come when her fire and her brambles will serve our cause far more than her beauty. All glanced again at Garian, and a strange knowing smile crossed his face. For some reason, Kenedra felt herself beginning to blush, then lifted her chin as if daring the blush to go any further. And now we get a really interesting reveal. It is to speak with thee that I have come, my daughter, all said directly to her then. Thou must abide here when thy companions depart. Do not venture into the kingdom of the Murgos, for if it should come to pass that thou makest this journey into Rock Cathul, thou shalt certainly die, and without thee the struggle against the darkness must fail. Abide here in the safety of Ulgo until thy companions return. So she says, I will do that. And All says, thus is the prophecy protected. Each of ye hath his appointed tasks in this work of ours, and I have mine as well. I will delay ye no longer, my children. Fare ye all well in this. We will meet again. And then he vanishes. And we read a little bit later on that, she is going to stay there, and she's talking with the Gorum, and Silk is talking with them as well. And the Gorum says, "You'll be as my beloved granddaughter while you stay in Ulgo, princess. We can walk together beside our silent lakes and explore long forgotten caves, and we can talk. The world outside knows little of Ulgo, and maybe that you will be the very first stranger to understand us." Right? And that's how that portion ends. So what do we have here? We've got this prophecy going on. It's not your standard fair fantasy. Oh, the great one was foretold of old and he's going to right all the wrongs. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And so it's quite interesting what Eddings is sketching for us in these discussions, mostly coming about in the third book, but foreshadowed in the earlier books and then coming to pass more in the books yet to come. Since we have the rather unusual luxury of knowing that next month there will be another video, another session focused ostensibly on the last two books of this series, The Belgariad, we can afford to put off certain themes until then. For example, the, company, the fellowship that develops. And so we might come back to some things in certain of these earlier novels, but because we don't want this to get overly long, there is one massive theme that I do want to talk about. So this is also centering on the chosen one, Garian, So you notice I've got a lot of passages marked out. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but I did want to talk about the magic that works in this universe. And already in the first book, we're getting a lot of stuff going on there. So in the beginning, we are learning about, Belgariad, who is being told about to Garion. Turns out it's actually Belgariad telling the story. And he says, who's to say what's only a story and what's truth disguised as a story? It's only a story, Garion said stubbornly, feeling very hard-headed and practical like any good Sendar. It can't really be true. Why, Belgariad the sorcerer would be, I don't know how old, and people don't live that long. 7,000 years, the old man said. What? Belgariad the sorcerer is 7,000 years old, perhaps a bit older. That's impossible, Garion said. It is? How old are you? 9, next Aristide. And in 9 years, you've learned everything that's possible and impossible. You're a remarkable boy, Garion. Garion flushed. Well, somehow not quite so sure of himself. The oldest man I ever heard of is old Weldrick over on Mildren's farm. Dernick says he's over 90 and he's the oldest man in the district. And that's a very big district, of course, the old man said solemnly. How old are you? Garion asked. Old enough, boy, the old man said. It's still only a story, Garion said. Many good and solid men would say so, the old man told him. Good men who will live out their lives believing only in what they can see or touch. But there's a world beyond what we can see and touch, and that world lives by its own laws. What may be impossible in this very ordinary world is possible there, and sometimes the boundaries between the two worlds disappear, and then who can say what's possible and impossible? Garion then says, I think I'd rather live in the ordinary world. The other one sounds too complicated. We don't always have that choice, Garion, the storyteller told him. Don't be too surprised if that other world someday chooses you to do something that must be done, some great and noble thing. And so that's, good foreshadowing for what's going to be happening later. Garion is, this is later on in it, he's actually hunting this wild boar up in Cherrick. And, we learn things about Garion. So the boar is appearing. Garion felt his heart quail. And then a peculiar thing happened. Garion felt his blood begin to surge. There was a wild ringing in his ears. He seemed to hear a defiant shouted challenge and could scarcely accept the fact that it came from his own throat. He realized he was stepping into the middle of the trail, crouching with his spear braced and leveled at the massive beast. And he manages to, spear the boar, right? Now, that's not magic, but it's showing us that there's something more in Garion. And this is something, by the way, that's going to show up later on as well. Then we are, now also in the Cherrick section. Aunt Pole has healed the eyes of an old woman, but also taken away her powers. And Garion is asking Wolf, who is, his grandfather, how did Aunt Pole do that to old March's eyes? And here we get the will and the word. Wolf said, it isn't difficult. I don't understand, Garion said. You simply will something to happen and then speak the word. If your will's strong enough, it happens. That's all there is to it, Garion asked. That's all, Wolf said. Is the word a magic word? Wolf laughed. No, there aren't any magic words. Some people think so, but they're wrong. Grolums, the priests of Tarek, use strange words, but that's not really necessary. Any word will do the job. It's the will that's important, not the word. The word's just a channel for the will. Could I do it? Garion asked hopefully. I don't know, Garion. I wasn't much older than you were the first time I did it, but I'd been living with Alder for several years. That makes a difference, I suppose. And now we're getting a bit of an origin story. What happened? My master wanted me to move a rock. He seemed to think it was in the way. I tried to move it, but it was too heavy. After a while, I got angry and I told it to move. It did. I was a little surprised, but my master didn't seem to think it was so unusual. And then Garion, a little bit later, says, I always thought sorcery had to be done with long spells and strange signs and things like that. And the wolf says, those are just the devices of tricksters and charlatans. They make a fine show and impress and frighten simple people, but spells and incantations have nothing to do with the real thing. It's all in the will. Focus the will and speak the word, and it happens. Sometimes a gesture of some sort helps, but it isn't really necessary. Your aunt always seems to want to gesture when she makes something happen. I've been trying to break her of that habit for hundreds of years now. And then we get a big reveal. Garion blinked. Hundreds of years? How old is she? Older than she looks, Wolf said. It isn't polite to ask questions about a lady's age, however. Garion felt a shocking, sudden emptiness. The worst of his fears had just been confirmed. She isn't really my aunt, is she? What makes you say that? Wolf asked. Well, she couldn't be, could she? I always thought she was my father's sister. But if she's hundreds and thousands of years old, it would be impossible. You're much too fond of that word, Garion, Wolf said. When you get right down to it, nothing, or at least very little, is actually impossible. How could she be? My aunt, I mean. All right, Wolf said. Polgara was not, strictly speaking, your father's sister. Her relationship to him was a bit more complex. She was the sister of his grandmother, his ultimate grandmother, if there is such a term, and of yours as well. Then she'd be my great-aunt. I don't know if I'd use that precise term around her. She might take offense. Why are you so concerned about all this? I was afraid she'd just said she was my aunt and there wasn't any connection between us at all. I've been afraid of that for quite a time now. Why were you afraid? It's kind of hard to explain, Garion said. You see, I don't really know who I am or what I am. Silk says I'm not a Sendar. Barrack says I look like a Riven, but not exactly. I always thought I was a Sendar, like Dernick, but I guess I'm not. I don't know anything about my parents or where they came from or anything like that. If Aunt Pole isn't related to me, then I don't have anyone in the world at all. I'm all alone, and that's a very bad thing. But it's all right now, isn't it? Wolf said your aunt is really your aunt. At least your blood and hers are the same. And then we find out, he's putting the pieces together. Aunt Pole really is my aunt or my great aunt? Yes. And she's your daughter? I have to admit that she is, Wolf said wryly. Well, if she's my aunt and you're her father, wouldn't that sort of make you my grandfather? Why, yes, he said, laughing suddenly. I suppose in a way that does. And so Garion, has family now. And these are family who are incredible magicians who are going to be teaching him some important things. So we find out as well, Master Wolf says, it's time for some plain talk. Most of you have some notion of what we're doing. I don't want anyone blundering into something by accident. We're after a man named Zedar. He used to be one of my master's disciple. Then he went over to Torak. He took the Orb of Alder. We're going to chase him down and get it back too. Barak says, isn't he a sorcerer too? That's not the term we use, Wolf replied, but yet he does have a certain kind of that amount of that kind of power. We all did. Beltera and Belkara, Zadar, all the rest of us. That's one of the things I wanted to warn you about. You all seem to have the same kind of name, Silk noticed. Our master changed our names. When he took us as disciples, it was a simple change, but it meant a great deal to us, right? So we're going to find out Torak isn't dead, just asleep, and the orb is going to, play some important role. Now, it's not going to do that until much, much later on. A bit later on, we're going to find out that there's other kinds of magic as well. Hetar has this capacity to understand horses, right? Garion says, what is it like to be able to hear a horse's thoughts? And Hetar says, I don't think I can describe it exactly. There's a kind of reaching out in a horse's mind, a sort of inclusiveness. And he goes on to explain it. It's a kind of belonging to a herd conception. Then later on, I'm going to skip over the Mudmen stuff, although there's some interesting magic going on there. We're also going to get some magic stuff coming up in the Tolnedra thing as there's a confrontation between Shamdar and Polgara. And then Garion is going to get himself involved. The voice in his head is going to play a role in this. So what we get is the voice says, not that way. Garion wants to take his knife and kill the evil priest. And the voice says, they won't let you, not with your knife. How then? Remember what Belgariad said, the will and the word. I don't know how. I can't do that, he says. You are who you are. I'll show you. Look. Right? Unbidden and so clearly that it was almost as if he were watching it happen. The image of the god Torok writhing in the fire of Alder's orb rose before his eyes. He saw Torok's face melting and his fingers aflame. Then his face shifted and altered it until it was the face of the Dark Watcher, whose mind had been linked with his for as long as he could remember. He felt a terrible force building him as the image of Shamdar wrapped in seething flame stood before him. Now the voice commanded, do it! It required a blow. His rage would be satisfied with nothing less. He leaped at the smirking Growlum so quickly none of the legionnaires could stop him. He swung his right arm, and at the instant his palm struck Chamdar's scarred left cheek, he felt all the force that had built in him surge from the silvery mark on his palm. Burn, he commanded, willing it to happen. Taken off guard, Chamdar jerked back. A momentary anger began to appear on his face. Then his eyes widened with an awful realization. For an instant, he stared at Garion in absolute horror. Then his face contorted with agony. No, he cried out hoarsely, and his cheek began to smoke and seethe where the mark on Garion's hand had touched it. Wisps of smoke drifted from his black robe as if it had been suddenly laid on a red-hot stove. He shrieked and clutched at his face. His fingers burnt into flame. He shrieked again and fell writhing to the damp earth. Stand still. It was Aunt Pole's voice this time, sounding sharply inside Garion's head. Don't weaken. Keep your will on him, Aunt Pole's voice told him. Garion stood over the blazing Growlum. The wet leaves on the ground smoked and smoldered where Chamdar thrashed and struggled with the fire that was consuming him. Flames were spurting from his chest. His shrieks grew weaker. With an enormous effort, he struggled to his feet and held out his flaming hands imploringly to Garion. His face was gone, and greasy black smoke rolled off his body, drifting low to the ground. Master, he croaked, have mercy. Garion's heart wrenched with pity. All the years of that secret closeness between them pulled at him. No, Aunt Pole's stern voice commanded. He'll kill you if you release him. I can't do it, Garion said. I'm going to stop it. As once before, he began to gather his will, feeling it build in him like some vast tide of pity and compassion. He half reached towards Chamdar, focusing his thought on healing. Garion, Aunt Pole's voice rang. It was Chamdar who killed your parents. A thought forming in his mind froze. Chamdar killed Garion and Ildera. He burned them alive just as he's burning now. Avenge them, Garion. Keep the fire on him. All the rage and fury he'd carried within him since Wolf had told him of the death of his parents flamed in his brain. The fire, which for a moment before it almost extinguished, was suddenly not enough. The hand he'd begun to reach out in compassion stiffened in terrible anger. He reached it. He raised it, palm out. A strange sensation tingled in that palm. Then his own hand burst into flames. There was no pain, not even a feeling of heat, as a bright blue fire burst from the mark on his hand and wreathed up through his fingers. The blue fire became brighter, so bright he could not even look at it. It is done, Aunt Pole's voice came again. They are avenged. And then her voice rang in the vaults of his mind. Belgarian, my Belgarian, right? And a little bit later, Garion knew differently. The will had been his and the word had come from him. Keep still, her voice, Pole's voice, warned inside his head. No one must know. Why did you call me Belgarian? He demanded silently. Because it's your name. Now try to act natural and don't bother me with questions. We'll talk about it later. And we read, she had called him Belgariad, and the name rung in his mind as if he'd always known that it was his, as if for all his brief years he'd been incomplete. Until that instant, the name had completed him. But Belgariad was a being who, with will and word and the touch of his hand, could turn flesh into living fire. You did it, he accused the dry awareness in one corner of his mind. No, the voice replied, I only showed you how. The will and the word and the touch were all yours. So he's got this incredible power, and we're going to find later on that he is able to learn things much more quickly than other sorcerers in the past were able to do. We have some very interesting things that I'm actually going to skip over in the realm of the snake god and Nisa. They're trying to control him, to use him, and he is going to ultimately break free because of the voice, again, in his head. And the serpent queen is actually going to be ultimately consumed by the serpent god itself, right? So I'm going to skip over those parts just in interest of time and move on. We're going to get some, like, your learning, your art parts as well, happening a bit later on. And we're going to have this confrontation between another god and the part of himself that is hiding in the shadows, so to speak. So we read, what happened was not sorcery. Garion knew it instantly. The noise was not there, nor that strange rushing surge that always accompanied sorcery. Instead, there seemed to be a terrible pressure as the full force of Mara's mind was directed crushingly at him. Then the mind within his mind responded. The power was so vast, the world itself was not large enough to contain it. It did not strike back at Mara, for that dreadful collision would have shattered the world, but it stood rather calmly unmoved and immovable against the raging torrent of Mara's fury. For a fleeting moment, Garion shared the awareness of the mind within his mind, and he shuddered back from its immensity. In that instant, he saw the birth of uncounted suns spiraling into vast spirals against the velvet blackness of the void, their birth and gathering into galaxies and ponderously turning nebulae encompassing but a moment. And beyond that, he looked full into the face of time itself, seeing its beginning and ending in one awful glimpse. Mara fell back. I must submit. And then he bowed to Garion, his ravaged face strangely humble. Your grief will end, Mara, the voice said gently. One day you will find joy again. So, pretty interesting and impressive stuff. A bit later, we're going to get some of the teaching happening. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of that. So Garion asks, what is sorcery? And he hears, I told you that once already, the will and the word. That doesn't really mean anything, you know. All right, try it this way. Sorcery is doing things with your mind instead of your hands. Most people don't use it because at first it's much easier to do things the other way. Garion frowned. It doesn't seem hard. That's because the things you've been doing have come out of impulse. You've never sat down and thought your way through something. You just do it. Isn't it easier that way? What I mean is, why not just do it and not think about it? Because spontaneous sorcery is just third-rate magic, completely uncontrolled. Anything can happen if you simply turn the power of your mind loose. It has no, now notice this, it has no morality of its own. The good or the bad of it comes out of you, not the sorcery. You mean that when I burned Asherak, it was me and not the sorcery? Garion asked, feeling a bit sick at the thought. Mr. Wolf nodded gravely. It might help if you remember that you were also the one who gave life to the colt. Those two things sort of balance out. What you're saying is it can be either good or bad? No, Wolf corrected. By itself, it has nothing to do with good or bad, and it won't help you in any way to make up your mind about how to use it. You can do anything you want to with it, almost anything that is. You can bite the tops off of all the mountains, or stick the trees in the ground upside down, or turn all the clouds green if you feel like it. What you have to decide is whether you should do something, not whether you can do it. You said almost anything, Garian noted quickly. I'm getting to that, Wolf said. There's one thing that's absolutely forbidden. You can never destroy anything, not ever. Garian was baffled by that. I destroyed Asherak, didn't I? No, you killed him. There's a difference. You set fire to him and he burned to death. To destroy something is to try to uncreate it. That's what's forbidden. What would happen if I did try? Your power would turn inward on you and you'd be obliterated in an instant. Garian blinked and suddenly went cold at the thought of how close he had come to crossing that forbidden line in his encounter with Asherak. How do I tell the difference? He asked in a hushed voice. I mean, how do I go about explaining that I only meant to kill somebody and not destroy him? It's not a good area for experimentation, Wolf told him. If you really want to kill somebody, stick your sword in him. Hopefully you won't have occasion to do that sort of thing too often. And then Wolf goes on to explain, the ultimate purpose of the universe is to create things. It won't permit you to come along behind it uncreating all the things it went to so much trouble to create in the first place. When you kill somebody, all you've really done is alter him a bit. You've changed him from being alive to being dead. He's still there. To uncreate him, you have to will him out of existence entirely. When you feel yourself on the verge of telling somebody something to vanish or go away or be not, you're getting very close to the point of self-destruction. That's the main reason we have to keep our emotions under control all the time. And he says, I didn't know that. You do now. Don't even try to unmake a single pebble. A pebble? The universe doesn't make any distinctions between a pebble and a man. Your aunt's been trying to explain the necessity for keeping you under control for several months now. You've been fighting her every step of the way, right? So very interesting stuff. And I'm actually going to skip ahead to the great, magical confrontation that is happening in the final chapter of the work. And we've got this essentially wizard's battle going on. Actually, not just that, but also Brill and Silk fighting as well. And so Belgariad and the high priest are going to be fighting each other. And we're going to get something very interesting happening. So first, the high priest tries to bargain with him, and then they actually have to fight. They have to pit their wills against each other, right? And we read, it came so quickly it was not a surge but a blow, and the sound of it was not the now familiar roaring in the mind but a thunderclap. Garian knew had it been directed at him it would have destroyed him, but it was not directed at him. It lashed again at Belgariad. For a dreadful instant Garian saw his grandfather engulfed in a shadow blacker than night itself. Then the shadow shattered like a goblet of delicate crystal, scattering shards of darkness as it blew apart. Now grim-faced Belgariad still faced his ancient enemy. Is that the best you can do, Ktakchik? He asked, even as his own will struck. A searing blue light suddenly surrounded the Growlum, closing in upon him, seeming to crush him with its intensity. And they go back and forth. The sorcerer and the magician faced each other in the center of the room, surrounded by blazing lights and waves of flame and darkness. Garian's mind grew numb under the repeated detonations of raw energy as the two struggled. He sensed their battle was only partially visible and that blows were being struck when he could not see, could not even imagine. The air in the turret room seemed to crackle and hiss. The turret itself trembled as the two dreadful old men ripped open the fabric of reality itself to grasp weapons of imagination or delusion, Without even thinking, Garion began to gather his will, drawing his mind in focus. He had to stop at the edges of the blows were smashing at him and the others. Beyond thought, now Belgariad and Kutchik, consumed with their hatred for each other, were unleashing forces that could kill them all. Garion, stay out of it, Aunt Pole told him in a voice so harsh he could not believe it was hers. They're at their limit. If you throw anything into it, you'll destroy them both. Get back, all of you. The air around them is still alive, is alive. Then what we find is the little boy who has the orb is walking directly towards Garion, his eyes filled with trust, the expression on his small face confident. He raises the stone in his hands, offering it to Garion, and he spoke a single word, errand, right? And what we find is an instant image filled Garion's mind, an image of a dreadful fear. He knew he was looking directly into the mind of Kutchik. There was a picture in Kutchik's mind, a picture of Garion holding the glowing stone in his hand, and that picture terrified the Growlum. He felt waves of fear spilling out towards him. Deliberately and quite slowly, he reached his right hand towards the stone the child was offering. The mark on his hand yearned towards the stone, and the Growlum's voice was a hoarse shriek. "Be not," he cried out, directing all his terrible power at the stone in the little boy's hands. For a shocking instant, a deadly silence filled the turret. Even Belgariad's face, drawn by his terrible struggle, was shocked and unbelieving. The blue glow within the heart of the stone seemed to contract, and it flared again. Kutchik, his long hair and beard disheveled, stood gaping and wide-eyed, an open mouth. Horror. "I didn't mean it," he howled. "I didn't, I." But now a new and more stupendous force had already entered the round room. It seemed to pull out, drawing at Garion's mind, drawing at him as it closed about the horrified high priest, who shrieked mindlessly. Then he seemed to expand, then contract, then expand again. Cracks appeared on his face as if he'd suddenly solidified into stone, and the stone was disintegrating on the awful force welling up within him. Within these hideous cracks, Garion saw not flesh and bone, but blazing energy. He raised his hands imploringly. "Help me," he screamed. He shrieked out a long, despairing no. Then with a shattering sound that was beyond noise, the disciple of Torok exploded into nothingness. Aunt Pole says, "He destroyed himself. He tried to unmake the orb. The mother of the gods will not permit unmaking." Right? And that is very close to the end of these books. So we get to see, sorcery, which we've learned an awful lot about in the course of these, getting unleashed at its most primal with some big, really heavy hitters. And then that caution about don't unmake things, it winds up being demonstrated in the figure of the high priest who slips up for a moment. So, great themes. We're going to come back to many of these as we go on to the next session in the series. That is quite enough for right now. Hopefully, if you haven't read these books, this entices you to begin reading them. If you have, perhaps you've enjoyed hearing about these grand themes and some of the passages, as well as the earlier matters that we covered with the world building and biography. So this is where we will leave off this session, and we'll pick up again with the final 2 books of the 5-book series, The Belgariad, next session.